Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice on the Giant Bookshelf. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of December 2023. This is my December wrap-up. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And if it's looking quite bright in here today, it's because it's snowing outside. So yeah, that's happening. And yeah, I thought I would film today for you the wrap up of everything I read in the final month of 2023. And as always, I'm going to be talking about them from my least favourite to my most, roughly. And before that, some stats. And after that, we will make our final check-in on the Giant TBR for 2023, and I'll be telling you what number I will be starting 2024 on. So stay tuned for that, but first of all, some stats about my reading in December. So I read 15 books for what Storygraph says is a grand total of 4,496 pages. And this included 4 audiobooks, 1 digital book, and 3 graphic novels, 4 books that were new to the TBR that I read immediately, 6 books that were on the Giant TBR, and 1 library book. So if that sounds like the numbers don't add up, it's because they don't, because in those numbers of audiobooks is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, which is also included in the TBR because I also had a physical copy of it, but I did predominantly listen to this on audio. I did carry some books on into 2024, some of which are finished now. They were Dombey and Son, Mouse by Art Spiegelman, Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett, which I have now finished, The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, which I've kind of started and then paused, and The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, which I'm currently listening to on audio. All of that said, it felt like a pretty good reading month, but I do think that I read some books that I possibly might have stopped reading if I hadn't have had like a good reason to read them. I don't think I've actually been very good at DNFing in 2023, so maybe that's something I need to think about doing more of in 2024, because I don't seem to always give up on a book when I am a bit bored. But anyway, starting with some books that I wasn't necessarily bored of, I was maybe disappointed by them a little bit. Those are not bad books. I would call this my good category to begin with. The first one is The Fourth Man by Lee Child. This one is a Jack Reacher short story, which was the only digital read of the month for me. I don't normally read anything on my phone, as you know, but a commenter on my Jack Reacher video mentioned that there was a Jack Reacher story that came roughly at the point in the timeline that I was at. So I gave this a go. I don't think, for me, Jack Reacher works that well as a short story. I've pretty much forgotten what this was about now, other than somebody came to Jack Reacher saying that they'd found an envelope of 4 pictures and now 3 of the people were dead and the 4th one was Reacher. So he investigated that. I believe he went to Australia in this one. Yeah, it hasn't really stayed with me, and it was probably my least favourite read of the month, but it was still Jack Reacher. It was still an enjoyable few pages. So next up, a book that I felt like had been on my mental TBR for years. I've wanted to read this since sixth form college, which is now a shamefully long time ago, and I was really, really disappointed, and that was The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This was actually my first try of Angela Carter, and I wouldn't let this put me off trying her again. I knew this was going to be strange. I knew it was going to be sort of based on fairy tales, but I didn't really like it very much, and I was expecting to love it. So the title story, The Bloody Chamber, is really very good. I enjoyed that, but I think maybe it wasn't as exciting as I thought it was going to be. And I mean, the rest of the stories I just didn't really get to grips with, or I didn't really like. And there's a very, very short story roughly in the middle of this, I would say, called The Snow Child, which, although it was only 2 pages long, was one of the most disturbing things that I've read, and I didn't like it at all. I didn't understand why it was there and why it was done, but yeah, I didn't want to read that, and it was just so shocking. But the rest of the stories I didn't really have that many strong feelings about. There's a few wolfish ones towards the end, and I thought those were probably the better of the stories. Don't get me wrong, I could tell from this that Angela Carter is a really good writer. There was some amazing description, and the way she drew on like source fairy tales was really interesting, but this short story collection unfortunately just didn't do anything for me, and where it sometimes did do something for me, that was not the sort of feelings I anticipated having from this book. That one was a miss for me, and I'm really, really disappointed because I waited so long to read it. So if you are an Angela Carter fan, please do tell me what is a better book of hers to try. I do like short stories, and I was very much in the mood for short stories when I picked this up, but perhaps I would be better trying one of her longer form books. Let me know in the comments what you think. The last 3-star read of the month was Crime at Christmas. This was one of the last books I finished in the year, and this was a Christmas gift from the lovely Emily from Novell Novels. I was really thrilled to receive this, and I'm always excited to have a new sort of golden age of crime book on my radar, because I hadn't heard of this before. Hadn't heard of the author, hadn't heard of the stories. And sometimes I think that some sort of classic mysteries that have been revived are just not hitting the spot for me, and I think that this is largely a problem with my own reading. I think I've been very, very spoilt by my love of Agatha Christie. I think that Christie just does things so well that sometimes when I now read other mysteries, particularly ones probably from the Golden Age, sometimes they just don't do for me what Agatha Christie does for me. And I think that that's a really difficult criticism to make, because obviously Agatha Christie's books are such a high standard to me that nothing is ever likely to meet up to it. However, let's talk about Crime at Christmas. I found this quite hard to get into, quite slow moving initially, and I didn't really love the detective character in this, who I think C.H.B. Kitchin did write about in some other books as well. I thought that the premise of this was okay. It was very much a sort of group of people gathered to a large house over the Christmas period. The guy who's telling this story is not part of the family who is gathered there. He's just sort of a hanger-on, really. The second half of this book was much, much better than the first half, which was a bit, felt like it was just sort of feeling its way around in the dark a bit, whereas the second half of this did pick up, was well plotted, and actually the solution was better than some of the meandering other stuff at the beginning. This was kind of a book that improved as it went along. Either Christmas mysteries are not for me, or I need to keep trying mysteries that are not Agatha Christie to find some that I really love. If you have any recommendations for me, once again, do let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear. Next up, we're going into the sort of almost 3.5-star territory, but I'm a bit unsure about this one because this was Buffy the Vampire Slayer Volume 3 From Beneath You, created by Jordie Bellaire, David Lopez and Raul Angulo. This one was very disappointing because Buffy herself is actually not in this book. Kendra the Vampire Slayer comes into this, which I did enjoy because I feel like Kendra is like a really underrated character from a really good series of Buffy, and I don't think they gave that character enough impact in the series and enough chance to shine. But this comic is clearly starting to redress that balance and give Kendra a little bit of a moment in the spotlight, which was fine, but I did feel like the story of this one was a bit lacking. First one in this series was absolutely brilliant and made me really, really want to read this series. The second volume, not as good, and the third one is the worst so far. I'm really, really hoping, and I have read from other people's reviews, that this does pick back up again in volume 4. So I'm very, very hopeful for that, and I have requested it from the library rather than buy more expensive graphic novels. But this was a Christmas present from my husband. Again, very, very grateful for it. Just wasn't a favourite when I actually read it. Oh, and Anya did appear in that one, and she was quite cool in it as well. 3.5 star books. I have 2 more. One was Arthur and George by Julian Barnes, and I was reading this with Carolyn from Carolyn's Reading Ramblings. This is a book that if I had not been buddy reading it with Carolyn, I would have probably DNF'd this book, because there was a long stretch of this book where I was really, really bored. And this is a very good example of a book where it could have done with losing 100 pages and we would have been no worse off whatsoever. In fact, we would have been better off. So I know that's often my opinion on longer books, but I do think there is a time and a place for a long book. For example, Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, where no detail is wasted. However, in this, there's just details for days and I didn't need them. This has a different writing style to writing styles I'm kind of used to, but I did enjoy it for the most part. And the author of the title is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. George of the title is a man who was wrongly imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, and his and Arthur's paths end up crossing after he has come out of prison and wants to clear his name. So this charts both men's lives from their childhood. I actually did find the childhood section quite interesting, particularly with George, and I actually found George by far the more interesting character throughout, which is really interesting to me because I definitely bought it for the Arthur Conan Doyle aspect. And I just felt like maybe because he was the figure who more was known about his side of the story, it just was quite dragging and boring in some of Arthur's sections. A lot of the stuff about Arthur was about a woman he had fallen in love with who wasn't his wife, and I just felt like that bit dragged on so much. And even if it's there because it's important and because Julian Barnes had done his research, I would have rather he'd have pared down that research or the amount of it that he gave to us for the sake of a more interesting read. Nearly DNF, but I decided to push through. I'm kind of glad I pushed through, and I mainly did that because I wanted to know what happened to George. This definitely has its sad moments, but I'm more sad about the fact that this sat on my TBR for more than 10 years and then I didn't love it. I have another book about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle on my shelf, Conan Doyle for the Defence, which this time is a non-fiction, and I think it's also about Conan Doyle getting involved in a case. So I wonder how that will compare and whether I will enjoy it more. Sad to say, Arthur and George was not a favourite for me. It also was potentially for me a little bit too much on the literary side. Just didn't quite hit the spot, sadly. Which was a shame because it had a lot of potential and a lot of really good bits. The final one in my good category is going to be When I Was 10 by Fiona Cummins. I was drawn into buying this book on audio in a 2-for-1 credit deal on Audible, and I listened to it straight away because it just sounded so intriguing, being about a girl who killed her parents when she was 10. Yeah, I think the blurb sells this book really, really well, and the actual reality of it is that it's a moderately good thriller. Thinking about my consumption of audiobooks, I do think that perhaps when I listen to thrillers and crime fiction on audio, I have a tendency to like them less, which is a real shame. So I have been being more careful about which ones I'm buying on audio and thinking to myself, would I prefer to read that on paper should I get it from the library, because I don't want to ruin books that could have been really good. I do think this would have been a really, really gripping read on paper. The three main characters, two of whom are the girls whose family was killed, and one of whom is their friend, their childhood friend, who is now a journalist. I thought that was really interestingly put together. I thought the way the plot fitted together and the minor twists were really interesting. There was just something about this that just didn't quite live up to a really, really excellent premise. Personally, for me, I preferred Fiona Cummins' other book that I read this year, which was Into the Dark. That one I did read physically, so perhaps I should decide to read Fiona Cummins physically rather than on audio, and see if it makes a difference for me. Nothing actually wrong with this book, it just wasn't quite as thrilling as the blurb made it out to be, but still enjoyable nonetheless. So moving into very good books, but this first one I have already done a full review of, and that's A Bitter Remedy by Alice Hawkins. If you've watched that review video, you will know that I did find several faults with this. I thought this is another book, actually, like When I Was 10, that has really, really good potential in its premise, but doesn't quite carry it out in as punchy a way as I would have liked. So I thought that this is another book with a much better second half than first half. Second half was really pacey, the first half was far too much slow build. The main problem with this was not really liking either of the narrators. I would still probably try Alice Hawkins again. I just don't think this quite hit the spot either. Finding that a lot of my December reads were not quite hitting the spot, but this one was one that I think I read most of in November and just finished off the ending in December. The next one is another audiobook that I picked up really to see what all of the hype was about. I listened to this one on Libby for free, and it was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This was a book that really intrigued me. It's a book about a woman who is an author, and her other author friend, who is much more successful than her, suddenly dies, and she steals her manuscript, edits it as her own, and publishes it as her own. And it's really a very interesting look at like the publishing industry and all kinds of things that are drawn from real life that have been quite scandalous in the book world. I did find that side of it really, really interesting. I did find the overarching storyline really, really interesting. I thought it was great the way R.F. Kuang had done this, and this was my first book by her, and I think I probably would try her fantasy books because I just was intrigued by the way she wrote this and the way she examines so many different things. I thought it was a really, really excellent look at a lot of things in modern life, and particularly in the book world. The narrator of this is incredibly unlikable, and that's clearly on purpose. I don't think you're meant to agree with pretty much any of her decisions from start to finish, but there are moments where you are made quite uncomfortable by kind of feeling like you're rooting for her a little bit, but usually those moments are smashed down and you think, what a terrible person again. So it was a really, really interesting book to read. I would recommend it to anybody who wants to check out what the hype is about, read a book about like dismantling all of the various vices of the publishing industry. I did enjoy like the twists and turns in this one. I think I may have enjoyed it more again on paper than I probably did on audio, but I still enjoyed it on audio nonetheless. Heading into very, very good books, and starting with a reread. So finally a reread. I didn't do particularly well at joining in with the rereadathon that was going on in the month, which was Remember December, but I did get two things for that. One later in this video, and the other was the pick for FOMO Book Club, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I read this and I read The Haunting of Hill House a number of years ago, and I couldn't remember so much about this one as I could about the other one, largely because after I watched the recent TV series of The Haunting of Hill House, I reread that book, I'm really, really glad to have reread this one as well. And I definitely now want to go on to read more Shirley Jackson because I think she's an absolutely great writer. I love the weirdness in this. This was excellent. If you want to hear massively spoilery thoughts about this, I do have a live show on this channel that was with the rest of FOMO Book Club, which is Gemma from Gemma Books and Jack from Spread Bookjoy, of course. And we talked about this book for well over an hour, despite it being probably the shortest book FOMO Book Club has yet read. So much to talk about and unpack in this sort of strange tale of two sisters living together, Mary Cat and Constance. The things that are revealed in this book are best kept secret. So yeah, if you want to find out those secrets, go away and read the book for sure. It's very short. If you don't want to read it and you do want to get spoilers, go and watch that live show because we talk all about all the different twists and turns in this one. But an excellent read, and I'm very glad I reread it. On to very, very good books, even more so. These I gave both of them 4.5 stars and I loved them. So this one is my Christmas gift from Gemma Books, Saga Volume 1, which has made me want to rush out and buy the entirety of Saga, which I won't do, but gradually I feel that I will be acquiring some of these because it was excellent. So this is written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by Fiona Staples. This is a sort of fantasy sci-fi graphic novel series which follows this couple on the front and their baby, and it's told by the baby, and they are from planets or moons that are kind of at war with each other. Their two races are at war and they are therefore not meant to be together, and so they are on the run and at the beginning having a baby. So they continue to be on the run with this baby, and I just thought that this was such a great storyline. I cannot wait to find out what happens in the next volume, and I will probably be buying it very, very shortly. I think I only gave this 4.5 stars because I felt like I loved it so much, but I felt like this was the introduction to this world. There was a lot to take in, and therefore I think that subsequent volumes have the potential to be even better. So I can't wait to get to more of this. Really, really enjoying graphic novels at the moment, and this was a fantastic one. The final book before my favourites of the month, and I do think that perhaps this could have made the favourites of the month. Perhaps I'm being a little bit harsh, but yes, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think this was the first book I finished in December, so it was a long time ago now. But there was some unfathomable reason why I absolutely loved this book. And I think because I couldn't fathom it out, I didn't give it 5 stars, but that doesn't mean it isn't a 5-star book. I think it's just really quietly good. Like with most of the Ishiguros that I've read, this book looks at memory and reminiscences and the way that memory can change and play tricks on us. And it also looks at looking back on a different time. It had a real sadness to this, particularly at the end, and I did shed a tear. I thought the main character, Stevens, our narrator, was just really, really lovable in his way. And he is the butler of an old hall, and he's thinking about the old days when the hall had more servants, but he is now living in a day where the master of the house is now an American who has bought it from the old owner. And this is about what happens when Stevens goes for a few days away in the countryside and, to be honest, spends most of the book thinking about his life and the various incidents in it. I just think this is a lovely book. A quiet book, but a lovely book. And I still think that Kazuo Ishiguro has potential to be a real favourite author for me. I haven't yet disliked any of his books that I've read. I wouldn't say any single one of them has been a 5-star, but they've all been really high 4 stars and books that I've really genuinely enjoyed. I can see why this is a lot of people's favourite Ishiguro. It's right up there for me, and I thought it was really, really well written, and I loved it. After having so many books that I've said were either disappointing or not quite what I wanted, didn't hit the spot, I do also have a really good selection for my favourites of the month, which were 4 5-star books, one of which was a reread. I'm actually going to save the reread for last and start with Best Served Cold by Jo Abercrombie. Without spoilering my favourites of the year, I think this is probably my favourite Abercrombie that I've read. This is the 4th Abercrombie that I've read, to put it into context. 3 of those have been this year. I'm reading these on audio predominantly with Jack from Spread Book Joy and Gemma from Gemma Books. And this year we finished off the First Law trilogy by reading Before They Are Hanged and Last Argument of Kings. And the only one out of those books that didn't get a 5-star was Last Argument of Kings, because I was so annoyed with the ending, and I still am. But for that reason especially, Best Served Cold was my absolute favourite so far. So Best Served Cold is the first of 3 standalones set in the First Law world. I thought that this was just a really, really great self-contained plot. And it follows Monza Makato, who at the beginning of the book has a terrible thing happen to her and is left for dead and ends up swearing revenge. So this is a whole massive book full of revenge plot, and it was excellent. The people she meets along the way, every single character in this was fantastic, whether they were a character you loved to hate or whether they were a character you were absolutely rooting for. Some characters for me were sadly lost too early in this story, but nonetheless, I really, really liked what Abercrombie was doing here, and it proved to me that Abercrombie can do a great standalone book. So yes, moving on with this series still, and currently listening to The Heroes, which I'm not enjoying as much, but this was an absolute standout of the month. Really, really great listen. Next up, another book in a series, another book getting 5 stars again, and that is Heartstopper Volume 5. I read this on Christmas Day. It was so cosy and lovely and just perfect. I love Heartstopper, and it's completely the sort of thing that I thought before reading Heartstopper last year that I was not the audience for, that I wouldn't like, and I was totally mistaken. This is lovely. Really, really enjoyed hearing the next part of Nick and Charlie's story as Nick thinks about going to university and applying for university, and Charlie carries on with doing his GCSEs and is kind of getting his confidence back. I loved seeing that, and I loved following this part of their story, and I can't wait for more. So a really, really lovely read, quite in contrast to all the other brutal reads that I've had this month. This was just absolutely special. Now, my top favourite book of the month that I had never read before is poetry, and that was The Advantages of Nearly Dying by Michael Rosen. This makes a very good companion book to Getting Better by Michael Rosen, which I listened to on audiobook back in the summer. But this one is obviously all told through poetry, and these are really, really hard hitting, and it's Michael Rosen writing poetry in the aftermath of what happened to him during the COVID pandemic, which is that he was in a coma for 40 days and nearly died. As you can imagine from that, it is really sad. It is very reflective and sometimes angry about what the government did during the pandemic, about just the situation, angry with the situation, I guess, but also looking back and trying to make sense of what has happened to him. And I just thought some of these were so moving, so powerful, and again, like the other Michael Rosen poetry collection I read this year, this had a few poems about Eddie, his son who died aged 18 from septicemia, and I just think that whatever Michael Rosen is reflecting on, he does it in such a way that I really always very much appreciate it and think that he really has a way with words even if those words are his way of trying to sort out in his own head and help him cope. And I think there was a big section in Getting Better about how writing and poetry did help him following COVID. So I think these books would work really, really well to read them together. Yeah, a really, really powerful and moving poetry collection. And I still think that Michael Rosen is a top person and fantastic at what he does. So a great, great book that I read in December. That one wasn't on any TBR, but I still ended up reading it and I was very happy that I did. The final book I do not have on me because I this time listened to it on audio, and this was also a reread, and it was a 5-star reread of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's only my second time reading it, although I watch A Muppet's Christmas Carol every single Christmas without fail. I listened to the Audible version with Hugh Grant as the narrator. I didn't think Hugh Grant was the perfect narrator for this. I thought he did a good job, but I would be open to listening to other actors read this because I didn't think it was perfect by any means, but I thought it was a good audio version of the excellent book by Dickens. I still found that the same favourite bits as last time were still my favourite bits. I still cried like a baby at the end because that is how I am with Christmas Carol. Lovely book to read, obviously, in December, an absolute favourite of the month. And I was buddy reading that one with Harmony, whose channel I will link below. That's all of the 15 books that I read in December. All that remains is to go through the Giant TBR numbers. And I've made this incredibly difficult for myself this month because we already know I'm a bit numerically challenged, but I also made my Giant TBR video of all of the books that I still have on my TBR, and I made it during December, so I'd already read some of these books before that and I read some of them afterwards, so bear with me. I did have 150 on the TBR at the end of November, but I did find one more when I filmed that video, so I'm going to go ahead and call that 151 to begin with. I then added Ulysses, which I bought for reading this year, and that took me up to 152 books. I then had my book sent from Mr. B's for the Crime Syndicate subscription. That was A Flaw in the Design, and that took me up to 153 books. I'm then going to have to do the ones I read in 2 parts. I then read The Remains of the Day, The Advantages of Nearly Dying, and Best Served Cold to take me back down to 150 books. I have also decided, based on what everybody commented on the Giant TBR video, to remove my books that are in other languages from the TBR, because technically I have read them before in English, so they will be rereads technically when I read them in another language. That removes 4 books from the Giant TBR, which takes me down to 146 books. I then also read A Bitter Remedy, The Bloody Chamber, and Arthur and George to bring me down to 143 books. I then received 10 books for Christmas that could potentially be added to the Giant TBR. That took me up to 153 again. And I then read 4 of my Christmas books, which was Heartstopper Volume 5, Saga Volume 1, Buffy Volume 3, and Crime at Christmas. So with those 4 read, that brought me down to 149 books on the Giant TBR. So miraculously, I stayed at the number that I was at the end of my Giant TBR video. Mainly I know because I've taken off 1 book in Spanish and 3 books in French, but every little helps. So my Giant TBR is starting the new year on 149 books. This year I really want to stay below 150 and I'd ideally like to get down towards 100. So we will see how that goes in future wrap-ups. That is all from me today. I had a lot of books to talk about and I think I've rambled on quite a lot. If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like and please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. I would love to hear from you in the comments. What were your favourite books of December? Did you read anything that was a top favourite for the year? Did you read anything like I did that really disappointed you or that you'd wanted to read for a really long time and then it just wasn't as great as you had hoped? I'd love to hear from you, all things bookish, in the comments down below. Thanks very much for watching today and I will hope very much to see you all again very soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.